This video I'm going to do is basically about the weather, the UK weather specifically. In this country we've had a lot of floods over the past few weeks, incessant rainfall, and this is one day where I can actually see some blue sky. Supposedly there's a big freeze on the way, but over the Christmas period there's been non-stop rain all around the country. It's been a concern for a lot of people, especially those in flooded areas. Major concern. But you see, you can be forgiven for thinking that this is some kind of natural phenomenon, that it's an act of God. Others would say, argue that it's to do with global warming. Well, let's touch on that subject first, global warming. First of all, where did this so-called theory come from? We have the first time I became aware of it, or the first document I became aware of, was released by the Club of Rome. It was called the First Global Revolution. Now, the Club of Rome was set up in the 60s by David Rockefeller. It's a round table group. It's connected with other so-called round table groups and steering committees, such as the Council on Foreign Relations, Trilateral Commission, the Bilderberg Group. And this report, I believe, was released in the 90s. And it basically talked about how they would be looking for a common cause to unite the people, to unite the populations. And that common cause would be something to do with natural disasters, or this is what they actually said would fit the bill: natural disasters, famine, water shortages, and global cooling or global warming. Right? So that was the first time I became aware of any documents talking about global warming. Now, in my opinion, global warming is nothing but a fraud, and all the so-called evidence is also fraudulent. Now, if we talk about the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, right, for example, we've got Rajinder Pachauri, who heads it. Basically, he's not even a scientist, he's an ex-railway worker, and he is up to his neck in fraudulent behaviour, where his companies are concerned.
So now they're saying we lied to save you.
Well, it's interesting, Alex. Are your listeners familiar with Dr. Rajendra Pachauri, the guy in charge, the beardy guy? He looks a bit like I call him the troll impersonator. He looks a bit like Saruman from Lord of the Rings.
Well, he looks like Osama bin Laden's older brother.
He does. Yeah, his uglier older brother. Yeah, that's the guy. Well, this Dr. Pachauri is in charge of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And as you know, he's been exposed for having all sorts of extraordinarily diverse business connections. You know, he's heavily involved in carbon trading. He's even got an involvement in an oil company, which is kind of weird, given that he's supposed to be saving the planet from big oil. Anyway, you know, he's in it up to the neck in carbon trading, which is a kind of, I think the most polite way of putting it is he has certain conflicts of interest. Okay, so this has been going on for quite some time. He's been exposed by us gallant bloggers. And who are the guys calling most loudly for his resignation? Why, funnily enough, they are the environmentalists.
All right, stay there, James. James Dillingpole, top writer over in England, author, researcher.
The connections with the CRU, the Climate Research Unit in East Anglia, right, and the evidence the research that they carried out was all manipulated. It turned out later through leaked emails that most of the research and the computer models they were using was basically manipulated, and it was all fraudulent, right? And not only that, the infamous hockey stick graph that was thrown about the media for so long, pointing towards rising temperatures, was fraudulent itself. Now, it's become it's well known now among the scientific establishment, especially climatologists, that it was a lot warmer during the medieval warming period in this country, and this is where the hockey stick comes in, because it was proven not long after the release of that graph that it had been manipulated to omit the medieval warming period.
Because people were absolutely desperate to hear the other side of the story, which they couldn't get in the mainstream news media, because the mainstream news media won't even give you the facts. They won't even tell you that global warming over the last 15 years hasn't been happening in any statistically significant sense. That has now, at last, been publicly admitted by Phil Jones, who's the head of the now deposed and disgraced head of the climate research unit at the University of East Anglia. He's been chucked out because he was caught trying to suppress and tamper with and hide and even destroy scientific data. And the ClimateGate emails that got released by a whistleblower there and have been all around the web did for him. But he was then interviewed by a sympathetic BBC interviewer who nevertheless got in touch with me first and said, what questions should I ask? And I thought, one thing you should ask is ask him whether there has been any statistically significant global warming for the last 15 years. And Phil Jones, albeit through gritted teeth, had to admit what he had never before ever publicly said, that yes, I've been right all along. There hasn't been any statistically significant global warming for 15 long years, a decade and a half. I mean, that is the most extraordinary admission by somebody who had been pushing out the official line that the most recent decade has been the warmest on the record. Yes, it has, but we still haven't had any significant warming for 15 years.
Speaking of gold, what does a hockey stick have to do with all this?
Well, this goes back to the start of it all. A professor at an American university named Michael Mann created a graph of temperatures through millennium flatlining and then shooting up at the end, the shape of a hockey stick. And the UN panel said, ooh, love that.
Yeah.
And they kind of made it their Bible, and it became the cornerstone of their whole campaign. Now it has been proved, without a shadow of a doubt, to be built on absolutely bad science.
Then you have people like Al Gore, who basically they're not actually arguing the case for global warming as such. They're actually promoting it, and it's basically they keep going on about this consensus that's being reached.
We're now told that you have to buy carbon offsets. In other words, if you have sinned by having a carbon footprint and by carbon emissions, you've got to buy a carbon offset, which is usually a scam. Somebody claims to have planted an acre of grass in the third world. It never happened. They take your money and laugh all the way to the bank. But they're telling you that in order to cleanse your guilt, you've got to buy a carbon offset.
Talk about carbon polluters. You talk about them. It's my understanding that back in 1997, when you were vice president, Enron's CEO, Ken Lay, was involved in discussions with you at the White House about helping develop this type of policy, this trading scheme. And is that accurate? Is it inaccurate? It's been reported.
I don't know, but I met with Ken Lay, as lots of people did, before anybody knew that he was a crook.
Right, and clearly you can see why so many of us are concerned about this type of cap-and-trade energy tax that would be literally turning over this country's energy economy.
I didn't know him well enough to call him Kenny Boy.
Well, but you knew him well enough to help devise this trading scheme, and obviously we know what Enron and these big guys on Wall Street like Goldman Sachs, and I know you've got interest with Goldman Sachs.
No.
Well, that's been reported. Is that not accurate?
No, I wish I did.
With executives from you're partnered in companies with executives from Goldman Sachs. Well, if you're not.
Al Gore has got to be the greatest con artist in modern history. This guy claims he invented the internet, even though it's on record he's a liar, and he got away with it. He was the pitch man that successfully sold, as vice president, NAFTA and GATT, that's lowered the standard of living in the United States and Mexico and almost completely deindustrialized our country. Now he's saying you should pay him and his private company, set up by Enron, a carbon tax on breathing. Look, if you want to buy Al Gore's propaganda, go ahead. But before you do that, you should at least look into the claims he's making.
Al Gore himself, he's nothing more than a, well, as Alex Jones believes, you know, you wouldn't buy a used car off him. He's a total con man. He was business partners with Ken Lay, the guy who got jailed over the Enron scandal. He's film Inconvenient Truth, which is now actually being shown in schools around the UK and US and elsewhere. The pupils is basically just propaganda. And as Christopher Moulton said in his video, in his interview with Alex Jones, and it's been in the mainstream media, that the High Court judge actually ruled that the film was basically full of lies and innuendo, and that a lot of it had to be taken out before it was used in schools for educational purposes. Then there's the argument that CO2, or man-made CO2, is the cause of so-called global warming or climate change. You notice they changed the name from global warming to climate change because the global warming was shown to be a total fraud. So, you know, the argument now is that any kind of erratic weather or any major natural catastrophe is due to climate change. Well, we all know that the climate changes all the time. That's just common sense. And also, they always miss out in their arguments. They always miss out the sun.
The globalists have co-opted the environmental movement. There are a lot of real environmental problems we face, like genetic engineering, where they're splicing plants, animals, insects, you name it. Toxic waste dumping in the ocean. No one wants to breathe bad air or drink toxic water. But the global carbon tax has nothing to do with that. It's a tax literally on breathing. Go out on the street or talk to your friends, your neighbors. Ask them, hey, should we ban dihydrogen monoxide? It's bad for the environment. The average person will sign your petition calling for the banning of water. That's right. Dihydrogen monoxide is water. It's the same thing with table salt, sodium chloride. And that's exactly what the establishment is doing with carbon dioxide. Ooh, dioxide. It has this scary sounding name. But the truth is, it's one of the 4 elements of life on this planet. Oxygen, carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight. And if the establishment can tax and list as a toxic waste one of those basic 4 building blocks of life, carbon dioxide, they can regulate and control every facet of our lives and shut down any businesses that aren't part of their New World Order.
The idea that carbon is a pollutant is essentially a way of saying that humanity is a disease or a cancer that ought to be wiped out. Genocide. People have argued in this environmental coterie around Obama, around Holdren, the theoretician of de-development, who is now the science advisor of the White House, really the anti-science advisor. They've argued that babies are carbon monsters, carbon machines, and that every time you breathe out carbon dioxide, you're part of the pollution of the planet. This is an absolutely anti-human doctrine.
They use the environmental movement to promote their real agenda, which is globalization and federalization and power.
The advisor to Gordon Brown wants to exterminate 1/2 of the population of the British Isles. Now, that's something Hitler might have tried to do, or Stalin. They didn't succeed. Will Gordon Brown do it? You can read this in the statements of these lunatics, radical environmentalists, fanatical Malthusians, tree huggers, whatever you want to call them. This is an ideology of genocide which can be documented exhaustively, ad nauseum, out of their own statements. If you think that bankers are the same as you, you're wrong. F. Scott Fitzgerald once told Hemingway, you know, the rich are different from us. And Hemingway said, yeah, they have more money. And F. Scott Fitzgerald replied, no, it's something much deeper. It's a whole different world. To be an oligarch, to be a Rockefeller or something of this sort, means that you're in a completely different world with values which are the reverse of human values. Now, if you allow the oligarchs to continue to dominate, the destruction of world civilization is a matter of a few decades at the very, very most. So, choose.
And once we understand that the whole theory behind global warming is flawed, or basically fraudulent, right? Then we have to ask the question why the weather, especially in the UK, has been so erratic the past few years. So let's look at the subject of chemtrails. Now, chemtrails is actually a term used by the US military. The scientific name is stratospheric aerosols, and the whole program itself is called geoengineering. Now, it's basically the manipulation of the weather. Now, there's a lot of historical evidence freely obtainable online. You can download it yourself, all these documents that I'm going to show on screen. Geoengineering reports published by the European Parliament, by other governments, the UK government, the United Nations, the US military and the US administration, the White House, and also there is a lot of research data that you can get freely available on the internet as well. Research papers covering the geoengineering programs that are being done worldwide. There's a lot of, as I said, there's a lot of research papers freely available online, and geoengineering reports being published by the Royal Society and UK governments and successive governments, and also European Parliament and the US administration. And yet the governments, the politicians, the political leaders have repeatedly denied that there's any such operations going on, and yet it's right above our heads. We can see it for ourselves. And there's also many films available on YouTube and on the internet in general. I'm going to show a few excerpts from a film called, first of all, there's one called What in the World Are They Spraying? And there's also a follow-up to that, which I'm going to show excerpts of, called Why in the World Are They Spraying? Now, once you come to understand that these programs are actually going on, and you will, once you watch this film, then you have to ask why. Why is it going on? Now, the film also tells you why it is going on, and the main reason is, again, it's part of the Hegelian dialectic. It's to control the weather, and I'm going to show on screen a document that's covered in the film itself called Owning the Weather by 2025, and it's a US military report that was done, I believe, again in the 90s, and it's freely available to download for yourself. You can read it in detail in a PDF form, All you have to do is put in owning the weather by 2025.
How can I look my children in the eyes and not try to shed the light on this issue, knowing every breath they take is laden with these metals? I have been forced to conclude that there is no greater or no more immediate threat to anything that lives and breathes than the global geoengineering programs, short of nuclear catastrophe.
Geoengineering is defined as the artificial modification of the Earth's climate. Geoengineers are proposing spraying 10 to 20 million tons of toxic aluminum and other substances into our sky for the stated goal of cooling our planet.
So let me distinguish these two different kinds of geoengineering as clearly as I can. So the first one is we call solar radiation management, and that's the idea that you could put mostly reflective particles or other means to make the Earth whiter, effectively to increase the Earth's reflectivity, reducing the amount of heat that's absorbed by the sun, and therefore exerting some overall cooling tendency on the Earth.
I think, though the initial results of climate models indicate that reflection of sunlight away from the Earth can offset most climate change in most places most of the time. But it will damage some places.
We've mostly thought about sulfur, and nevertheless, there might be some good reasons to think about aluminum. It turns out, first of all, there's been a lot of work on the environmental consequences of aluminum in the stratosphere. There's a bunch of papers going back to the 70s that look at the radiative and ozone-destroying properties of aluminum in the stratosphere, and those make you think it might be useful. Do this in just a jet in a very simple way. Make high-quality aluminum particles just by spraying aluminum vapor out, which oxidizes. So it's certainly, in principle, possible to do that.
Since we released What in the World Are They Spraying?, hundreds of people from around the world have began taking rain tests. What they're finding is what many are calling the chemtrail geoengineering footprint of aluminum, barium, and strontium.
The primary ingredients in geoengineering are specifically the oxides of metals, including aluminum oxide. This is devastating to plants, totally devastating. The trees are dying.
Where is this mountain of metal coming from? Why is asthma, ADD, Alzheimer's, autism, all elements related in many studies to aluminum or particulate inhalation? Why are these ailments going off the charts with no apparent explanation? Why has respiratory mortality in the continental United States gone from 8th on the list to 3rd in 6 years? And no one seems to ask any questions. Why every other person has asthma now? Why every other commercial on TV is an allergy medication? And again, when David Keith, the world's most recognized geoengineer, was asked on the record, had there been any studies done as to the consequences of dumping 20 million tons of aluminum in the atmosphere, his answer was patently no.
While geoengineers claim that their models are to cool the planet, a number of studies now are arising that indicate, yes, temporarily there will be regionally cooling as these particulates reflect the sun. However, they actually at night act as a blanket and will warm the planet. So the question now remains, why in the world are they spraying?
And for the better part of 30 years, I worked in the aerospace and defense industry. Had a secret clearance twice during my career. Some of the technology that I saw or participated in the creation of tends to play a role in some of the things that are used to control the weather. The very distribution process is being employed in the aerosol campaign, manipulating the weather, crops, taking over the food production or controlling the food production, the military applications. The process evolved when they realized in the 1800s that you can put things into the environment that will influence the uptake of moisture and where it drops out of the atmosphere.
4 degrees.
Again.
It broke the former record by 32 degrees. There's very profound things that people don't notice. Blue skies almost never. We almost never have dew on the ground. That's a known consequence of geoengineering if they did it, which they appear to be. It sucks the moisture out of the atmosphere. It doesn't descend, doesn't form dew. We have massive temperature disruptions. People are starting to wonder, why is it 80 degrees one day and then snowing the next day at 50 degrees or 45 degrees and then back up to 80 the day after that? When you push and pull the climate with these manipulation programs, of which there's a mountain of data to corroborate their existence, then you start to have massive fluctuations in the system. And we saw in March in the continental U.S. there were 15,232 temperature records broken. That's profound. Some of the daytime highs, the former records were broken by as much as 32 degrees. Don't people wonder?
If you can control where moisture is collected and where it's dropped, so to speak, in the form of rain or any other kind of precipitation, then you can really, you can do everything. You can steer the weather system. If you want to be able to manipulate the weather, one of the things we know about the materials that are being used in the aerosols, we've seen everything from aluminum oxide, barium salts, strontium, copper sulfate, potassium iodide, a number of different kinds of things, each of which have different levels of reactivity with the moisture in the air. Some like aluminum oxide.
An array, a field of antennas, radio frequency antennas. They're 72 feet tall, and they have a cross diapole across the top that's about 60 feet in each direction. 180 of these are in the array today, so you can imagine this field of antennas. What happens is by firing each one, they produce radio frequency energy that normally comes off of an antenna, spreads out rather rapidly. Same principle. Principles in physics would be like a flashlight shining on a wall. You know, you start with a narrow beam, and by the time you hit the wall, you've got a wide beam. The idea with HAARP is to get it to focus or concentrate that radio frequency energy so it doesn't spread out, so you can hold it tighter together and then manipulate it in very specific ways. Weather control is a broad topic, so there's lots of ways to control and manipulate weather. HAARP is one of them, because you also have private sector companies getting into this business. Environmental manipulation is like the ultimate method of covert warfare, because you can literally shut down food production. You can create a situation where the people within a country revolt against their own government, and you're invited in to mop up the mess. The issue of owning the weather by 2025, it's just a military publication. We've quoted it as far back as, I think, 94, 95 even. But you go back to these earlier reports and you look at sort of what was the objective, and the objective is exactly that: control the battlefield environment. When you start talking about manipulating the environment, we have treaties that go back to the mid-70s that forbid this, number one, as weapons of war.
So the perfection of weather modification took place, but it became apparent that using weather modification for wartime purposes was not acceptable to the United States government and other nations of the world. So therefore, the NMOD Treaty came into being and was signed by the United States government after passing Congress. The reason it was signed and implemented was because it would ban warfare, weather modification techniques and use during times of war.
Almost all of our treaties that we've signed, including the non-proliferation, counter-proliferation treaties, chemical treaties, the ones that were signed recently, last few years, back maybe a decade now, I guess time goes. But they had domestic exemptions, and so does the environmental treaty, where you can do whatever you want in your own territorial boundaries. When you start manipulating weather in one part of the planet, it doesn't look on the ground and say, oh yeah, wait, this is the boundary of a political boundary. It fails to recognize those. So you start to talk about geophysics and manipulating the planet itself. Then it's a question of those kinds of exemptions should you be allowed.
Absolutely entirely possible to profit from the weather.
My name is Michael Agnew. I'm an independent trader. Trading commodities at the CME Group, member of the Chicago Board of Trade, and have traded derivatives and futures cash for over 15 years. Weather derivatives are financial instruments that firms would use to hedge risk concerned with adverse weather conditions. The first weather derivative was originally traded by Enron back in 1997. Weather derivatives started in 1999 at the CME Group. Big utilities, reinsurers to hedge against hurricanes or tornadoes or flooding, some sort of catastrophe, hedging against a cooler summer or a warmer winter. Let's just say I was insuring a product for $5 million, no matter what it was. Let's say if I was a utility company, a farmer, whatever it was. Let's say I had $5 million worth of crop, but I can do derivatives that are worth double that amount, and I can control the effects to where I collect on the insurance that's worth $10 million as opposed to selling the crop for $5 million, yes, I could definitely profit from that. 2010, 2011, Southern Illinois, Missouri, those, you know, we had a high peak of tornadoes and those types of adverse weather conditions definitely raised the price of commodities as well as drove the volatility, which also raises the price of commodities. You're going to make more money if a crop fails. You're creating insurance that's over the price of what your crop is worth, let's say. So if you can control the weather, you control how these products grow. And if you had an insight to how these products were actually seeded and what products you use to actually grow those items, corn, soybeans, and you can control that market, it's unlimited profit potential if you can control the weather.
If you want to send, cold into the Midwest, you buy up pipeline capacity, you buy up options on heating and cooling degree days, you buy derivatives off of rainfall. There are mechanisms that you can make hundreds of billions of dollars annually and defray a huge chunk of the cost of this just on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, playing with derivatives in the weather market.
Weather derivatives are basically, you're betting that there's going to be a weather disaster, and you're betting that it's going to occur within a particular time frame in a particular location, and then, the money that you put up basically is like a bet. It's like a wager, saying that this incident's going to happen here, and then when it does happen, there's a big payoff. And that big payoff is something that motivates people to continue to participate in this kind of thing and maybe even feed the very process that's causing the bad weather to happen. Particularly if there's a connection between the people that are seeding the clouds and the people that are making investments.
This is a new opportunity. It's a new tool for investors. Even if someone has no interest in, going on the offensive side and buying things, it definitely behooves them to be aware of what's going on out there. The extreme weather is here, and it's not going to reverse itself. The weather event has to be severe.
Ionospheric heating, in fact, these instruments, when they were first utilized, which is in the former Soviet Union back in the 70s, they started out, and they still call these ionospheric heaters because in one mode of operation, you can literally create above this instrument on the ground, you can heat an area up to 30 miles in diameter in the ionosphere. So you heat it up, and by heating it, it literally raises it. So then imagine this column moving up several hundred kilometers out, and then the lower atmosphere begins to rush in and fill that vacant space, that void. And as a result, you're altering pressure systems for quite a distance, which of course alters the weather. You're also able, if a jet stream is coming in the air, you're able to alter its course. And if you alter a jet stream, even a small amount, then the swing factor on the other end, you can move it so you're moving storms, say, out of the Midwest onto the East Coast, or this kind of thing, by just swinging it high in terms of its flow and getting it redirected.
Okay, so now if we look at precipitation, much has been made of this issue of damage from precipitation.
Which the particulates that these trails have introduced into the sky are, let's just say the storms can develop more violently, more quickly, in places that are not necessarily as where you would expect them to be. And so we see more flooding, we see more intense droughts, we see rainfall rates of 1 to 2¼ inches an hour that are just bizarre, and sometimes even rainfall 1.25 inches a minute is just unheard of.
And so you have an area that's already been heated by the sun's rays, and then you have the aerosol drift in over that area, and it's reflecting both ways. It's reflecting the heat of the sun back out, but it's also trapping the heat that's already been created there by the sunlight. So it will actually create more heat and trap heat inside and closer to the atmosphere. It can actually exacerbate global warming problems.
And if you become more aware of what's happening, where the global commodities are, what extreme weather events, you're one step ahead of them.
And significant loss of property and crop production. Many times this will cause farms to go out of business. And when farmers go out of business, they usually have to sell. And then if there's somebody waiting in the wings to buy their land and then turn that land over to the production of genetically modified crops, you can see where there would be kind of a strategic advantage there.
There's something that happened in the Midwest, and I'm sure everybody's heard about the flooding in the Midwest. And what happened is George Soros and his big corporate monolith went in and started buying up the farmland. So not only is it creating all these stresses, it appears to be a corporate land grab. In other words, when the farmers, the small farmers, go out of business, they're wiped out through these droughts and everything, then the big guys come in, buy up the land.
And if you think of Western history, there's a lot of it concerning water rights and even water wars. And so they were shooting about access to water to water your livestock. And now people are thinking, or at least the people who are involved in weather control sometimes think about the river of moisture above our heads. And geez, if we could just tap that. But that too is a water right. That would involve access to people that felt that maybe they had prior rights over it.
You're reducing the food security of people through deploying these kinds of approaches that
potentially 2 billion people could have their food disrupted by such
One of the suggestions about geoengineering has been that we genetically modify trees and plants. We genetically modify crops to be aluminum resistant, and this is ongoing at this time. And part of the geoengineering scheme is to say we're going to put all these chemicals and particles into our atmosphere, which is going to cause air pollution, water pollution, changes in soil pH, and could disrupt agriculture crop production to a great degree. So therefore, instead of saying that maybe this isn't a good idea that we pollute our air, water, and soils with the chemicals we're going to put into the atmosphere, which do come back down, there is a scheme abounding, which is happening right now, to modify some crops so that they are aluminum resistant to the types of chemicals and particles they're going to put into the atmosphere.
It's just going to get worse until the point where we're not going to be able to grow anything at all unless it's a Monsanto genetically modified, abiotic stress resistant seed.
The chemical companies and the and Monsanto and all of these companies are working together to make us totally dependent on their products for growing corn or growing any kind of agricultural product or trees, whatever. We're going to corporatize not only where the rainfall goes and who gets it through geoengineering and weather modification schemes, but we're also going to say that these are going to be the only crops that are going to grow in areas where we're putting in toxic chemicals that are coming down and altering the soils.
One of the most basic things about human society is that we need food and water. And these are two of the things that are most severely dependent upon good weather. Rain at the right time of the year, sunshine so crops can grow, not enough sunshine and they don't grow, too much water, the plants die, not enough water, the plants die. All of this goes back to the amount of food that's available. So if you starve people, they will be vulnerable. They will be much easier to manipulate and forced to do whatever a government wants them to do. So if you control how much food there is, or its availability, through things like the weather, or using the weather as a strategic tool militarily, you can, dramatically influence what's going on in a country. And by doing that over and over again, sequentially through a region, it's possible that you can change the political spectrum over an entire region by doing this over and over again. Maybe even, do it over a much wider region, create so much instability that you're able to, come in and say, oh, we have these wonderful fast-growing crops, genetically modified, and this, you'll have something to eat in less than 3 weeks, and I imagine that, if you can control the food supply, that you can then consolidate the financial and the political interests of a country.
Could predicting the weather enable a group or specific entity to profit from that knowledge of knowing what type of weather or weather pattern will be? Absolutely. That's what all commodities are driven by. They're driven by predicting the weather, how the weather will be in a certain location, and that directly is correlated to the price of that commodity. Absolutely.
If you can control the weather, then you can control where the rain falls or where it doesn't fall.
There's also that social action documentaries, such as one called Look Up, that talks about chemtrails. And there's also a lecture by a UK university graduate called David Lim, and I'll put that on screen for you. You can actually get that on YouTube as well. So there's a plethora of films and documentaries freely available on YouTube that you can watch for yourselves, and also the documents I told you about explaining how these programs are being carried out. And yet our governments will deny this is going on. Now, you have to understand then, once you realise that these programs are widespread and ongoing, why everybody is being basically inundated with all these different illnesses, such as dementia, Alzheimer's. I mean, I'm going to put on screen also documents basically showing what metals are being sprayed, and these are nanoparticle form, folks, right? And you know, there's such a thing as gravity. We are breathing all this in. It's contaminating the soil, it's contaminating the water, it's contaminating the air that we breathe. So is it any surprising that people are basically going down with all forms of cancer, and as I said, dementia and Alzheimer and other autoimmune disorders?
My name's David Lim. I'm a doctoral researcher at the University of Reading. I went back into education in 2006, 2007, and I completed a master's degree in renewable energy engineering. Geoengineering affects everybody. I think I put in my article, if you breathe, it affects you. So extreme weather events are increasing because our weather is being manipulated. Food prices are increasing because crop production can be controlled. And illness is increasing because geoengineering chemicals are toxic. So there you have it. There's a snapshot of what the whole evening is going to be about. Okay, geoengineering and government. I'm not making it up. There is a thing called geoengineering. The House of Commons have got a paper on it. The regulation of geoengineering came out in 2010. And the definition in this document says geoengineering is activities specifically and deliberately designed to effect a change in the global climate with the aim of minimizing or reversing anthropogenic climate change. Anthropogenic being man-made.
Can tonight reveal the true extent of the germ warfare tests carried out in the southwest. Government documents show much of North and South Devon and parts of Somerset were used for experiments similar to those conducted off the Dorset coast during the 1960s.
An independent inquiry has already been ordered into the Dorset trials to determine whether or not they've affected people's health. In a few minutes, we'll be speaking exclusively to the man in charge of this inquiry. But first, our environment correspondent, Simon Hall, has this special report which includes film of the trials never previously seen on television.
The germ warfare trials carried out in the 1960s and 70s were highly secret. This previously unreleased film of the experiments as they happened. Their existence was revealed last year when secret documents were declassified. They were thought to be carried out mainly in Dorset. A spotlight investigation has, though, discovered they were far more widespread than was previously thought. Other trials tested how the germs would survive in different conditions in different areas. These were based not on releasing a gas, but instead on exposing a narrow thread of material coated with E. coli to the air. These tests were carried out in January 1967. The threads were exposed first from a ship just off Ilfracombe, then on 5 other sites, running through Somerset down to the sea off Dorset.
I want you to hold that in your thoughts for just a second. So that was E. coli, bacteria.
First tonight, Spotlight can reveal the Dorset village, which has suffered a series of birth defects, was exposed to enormous quantities of chemicals in 1959. Families in East Lulworth are already demanding a public inquiry into germ warfare tests carried out in the 60s. Now documents show chemicals were dumped by aircraft over Dorset in quantities that were up to 1,000 times greater than the rest of the country. Our environment correspondent Simon Hall has this exclusive report.
The aim of the airborne tests was the same as those carried out from ships, to examine how vulnerable Britain was to a germ warfare attack. This, though, is the first time a chemical known to be toxic was used, zinc cadmium sulfide. Scientists say that cadmium is the most worrying component. It is carcinogenic, and studies have shown it can cause birth defects in rats. It's unclear if it could have the same effect in humans.
Its health effects include damage to the lungs, kidneys, and to the liver, and also cancer of the lungs and prostate have been found.
The test was carried out in August 1959. A plane flew above the North Sea, then along the English Channel, spraying the chemical. Typical numbers of particles detected were 0, 1, 8, 12, and a maximum of 38. But when the plane reached the end of its track, something happened. That resulted in Dorchester sampling 4,315 particles. There was no sample point at East Lulworth, but it lies directly in the chemical's path.
They've done it to us before. I and many believe that it's happening to us again. The Guardian broke this in 2002. The headline reads, "Millions were in germ war tests." The Ministry of Defence turned large parts of the country into a giant laboratory to conduct a series of secret germ warfare tests on the public. And the article goes on, and I can give you all of the links to everything I'm talking about is referenceable, and you can have this. I won't labour this slide, but the two clips you saw were the first two, the fluorescent particle trials, the large area coverage trials, the zinc cadmium sulfide so it's all kind of colour coordinated. So the red is the E. coli and Bacillus globuli, which is the anthrax mimicking spore. Sabotage trials were the transport. So they released chemicals into carriages, in the underground, I believe, as well, on the underground. And I've called this, the other one, the spider's web trials. What they did is put germs onto spider's webs and release them into the atmosphere just to see what the outcome would be. And if that wasn't bad enough, with the bacteria, in 2001, the BBC broke this story, rainmaking link to killer floods. Do you remember the Lynmouth floods? Some of you maybe, 1952, just up the road from here, more or less. 35 deaths in the infamous Lynmouth flood disaster came only days after RAF rainmaking experiments over southern England, it has emerged. And then it goes on to talk about 90 million tonnes of water swept down the narrow valley, destroying buildings. Right. What do you think the official government's position is on geoengineering? Don't panic. We're only considering geoengineering chemicals. No activity is taking place at the moment. People have written to their MP, and the standard reply is that no activity's been taking place. They have no reason to believe that chemtrails are being sprayed in our skies. That's in Europe, a bit closer to home, London, Trafalgar Square. See a nice horizontal trail there. Anybody hazard a guess where this one is? 200 metres behind me, in a field, looking west. Not one cloud in that sky is natural. This was one of the worst days I've ever seen in Trent, and this only happened 2 weeks ago. It was on the 15th of March, and again, the only cloud that's natural is this little grey area here. The rest of the sky was covered in this murky haze. The word chemtrail, if anyone says to you, it's a made-up word or whatever, US Congress made up the term chemtrail initially. House Bill 2977 the Space Preservation Act 2001, page 5, line 15. It's there. It's there under exotic weapons. Okay, so this is a static. It just shows you the chemtrail or persistent contrail. And there's a raging debate as to what to call them. As a scientist, they can't be called chemtrails. No academic journal will look at you seriously if you call them chemtrails. So you have to call them persistent contrails or cirrus-induced cloud contrails. So a normal contrail is, should dissipate after about 30 seconds, 20 minutes or so. They are ice crystals, water, carbon dioxide, a bit of sulfur. But the things that we're seeing in the skies nowadays linger for a lot longer. NASA is on record saying that some of the chemtrails will last about 20 hours. So this is what's happening. The chemtrails, persistent contrails, are being taken, some of them, by the wind, depending on the regime, and it's creating artificial cloud cover and p-dichlorobenzene. And on the military side of things, you have aluminium-coated fiberglass, and these are put out for radar, what's the word, buzzing noise, and barium salts. The two at the bottom, sulfur hexafluoride and trimethyl aluminium, is what is being added to normal jet fuel, and they have neurological effects. They cause short-term memory and all sorts. Again, all on record. So the other chemicals and particles, thorium, cadmium. Cadmium was the one, cadmium sulfide within the clip, carcinogenic. Chromium, potassium, titanium, magnesium. Arsenic's been found, manganese, lead. In total, 49 different chemicals have been reported. Okay, there are 3 other class of particulates that are being found. Polymer nanofibers, desiccated erythrocytes, and erythrocytes are freeze-dried red blood cells, mold spores, and fungus. So for the aim of this talk, I'm not going to go into those areas. I may do another talk in the future where I unpack that a bit more. So yeah, what goes up must come down. So as you can imagine, it's landing in our oceans, it's landing in our rivers, watercourses, in our soils, our crops, trees, bees. People have been wondering where they've been going. Livestock, our pets, and if it's landing all of this, landing on all of that, what else is it landing on? And this is for me, all of it's horrific, but it's landing on us as well. So the environmental impacts, we're seeing acidification of our oceans. The soil pHs are becoming slightly more alkali. Our crop is starting to suffer in different ways with adiabatic stress. The yields are reported to be lower in many instances. There's a phenomenon, especially in the States, where trees are dying. Aluminium is bad for the ozone, air quality, marine life, and of course our pollinators. And out of all of those, for me, and this is where it kind of really strikes a chord for me, you can choose what you drink. You can drink tap water, fluoridated. You can drink spring water. You can drink beer. You can drink whatever you want. You can eat. You can have a choice what you eat. Organic, non-organic, prepared foods. You can't choose what air you breathe, can you? This is asthma, childhood asthma, muscle weakness, eye and skin irritation, autoimmune. Now, autoimmune, I could, again, unpack and come up with a huge list of things. Aluminium has been linked to neurological and cognitive dysfunction, short-term memory loss, SAD, seasonal affective depression, chronic bronchitis, liver damage, and again, 2 biggies coming up, Alzheimer's. Again, aluminium-related, some people say dementia. Barium is not good for the heart, cardiac system, and dimensions, the magnitudes that we're talking about here. So, damage to the central nervous system. Dementia, Alzheimer's, we've covered. Short-term memory loss. Lethargy, people waking up and just, melancholy, not wanting to do much. Severe trembling, pulmonary fibrosis, and lung damage have all been associated with aluminium and aluminium oxide. Next on the list is barium. Barium is extremely soluble in water, so constant exposure hits our immune system for 6. It increases blood pressure. Weak and aching muscles have been associated with barium. I think I suffer from that sometimes. When you wake up, you're all achy and it feels like you've done a couple of marathons and you've just been sitting at your desk all day the day before. Stomach irritation, changes in nerve reflexes, difficulties in breathing, asthma again. Barium also depletes our potassium levels. And again, on the lesser end, let's say, the headaches, dry eyes, and the sore and raspy throats. The last chemical we'll look at is sulfur. Now, sulfur, we need sulfur actually, but derivatives of sulfur, like sulfur dioxide and hydrogen sulfide, are not good for us. Again, so this interacts with our neurological pathways and our synaptic pathways, changes in behaviour, disturbances in blood circulation again, like barium, heart damage. It affects our eyesight, our reproductive system, again, our immune system, stomach, liver, kidneys, hearing, hormonal metabolism, and dermatological effects. A neurologist from the US, Dr. Blaylock, is on record saying, when talking about chemtrails, he was saying, I took these stories with a grain of salt, like many of us do initially. And then he goes on to say, my major concern is that there is evidence that they are spraying tons of nano-sized aluminium compounds. Then he goes on to say, of special concern is the effect of these nanoparticles on the brain and spinal cord, as a growing list of neurodegenerative diseases, including Alzheimer's, dementia, Parkinson's, Lou Gehrig disease, are strongly related to the exposure of environmental aluminium. So what is the effect of reduced sunlight? Just that factor alone. Increased molds, increased mildew, greater susceptibility to viruses again, reduced crop yields. Studies in Illinois University have shown, everything else being equal, all the climate conditions, reduced yields. Ecosystems. Nearly every ecosystem relies on photosynthesis at some level. So just that ring alone, you could say, this is big stuff. SAD again, people constantly being under this blanket of cloud. It's a lot worse in London, apparently, than it is out here. Vitamin D again, so the whole vitamin D, rickets thing, strong bones and teeth. And this one's a bit odd as well, solar PV. So you have government pushing renewable energy technologies, solar PV. We're having huge investment of solar over the past few years, but yet people are reporting 40, 50, 60% drop in solar output from this excess cloud cover. And yep, organisations are reporting on it. The BBC in 2005, why the sun seems to be dimming. In this article it says there was a staggering 22% drop in sunlight, so that's average, falling by 10% in the US, 30% in former Soviet Union, and 16% in the British Isles. Okay, this is the big one. Why? Everybody's asking, why are they doing this? Why? Why would the government be doing this to us? So, I believe that the sales pitch to us is, due to man-made global warming, the planet needs to be cooled. That's what the IPCC are saying, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They're saying we need excess cloud cover to bounce the sunlight, redirect it out back into space. However, the climate change science isn't settled. The IPCC is a kind of political organisation. It's not scientific. And this is the big risk, when you start marrying political and academic spheres, when policy is funding academia, you're going to get political driven outcomes. This is an interesting one I came up with. and many people have sourced this. This is a report by the Club of Rome. Came out in 1991, and if you haven't come across this, it's quite an interesting read. It's called The First Global Revolution, and the UN think tank was tasked with the idea of coming up with various schemes to unite humanity, basically. It came up with it had other aims and objectives as well. Depopulation was another one. On page 75, under the heading, "The Common Enemy of Humanity is Man," quote, "In searching for a common enemy against whom we can unite, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine and the like, would fit the bill." Why else would they do it? Why else would government geoengineers be doing this if the science doesn't stack up? The first agenda, first and foremost, I think, is to control the weather. And when you can control the weather through various means, you can start to manipulate public opinion with certain things, like getting people to buy into the idea of man-made climate change. I'm not saying man-made climate change, we are, and you have to pick it apart really carefully. Man-made, man. Which men, people? Is it the public? Is it government? Social control mechanism. So when you can control the weather, you can put upon society some very rigid social controls. Control food supply and cost. We all need food. Corporate profit. There are corporate profit motives that I'll show you in a minute to this. Enhanced military capability. I think we touched upon it with the HARP and the radar noise. And geopolitical agendas. And these are just some of them. And these are the main kind of 7 that I've identified. Modify it to create extreme weather. You can create floods, droughts. If you seed the sky with particulates that are so fine, the water molecules cannot create the mass to bring them down again. So it kind of dissipates the rain, as so to speak. Storms, hurricanes. Military can now steer hurricanes. And there's a paper on steering hurricanes. Erosion, hail damage, blizzards, so again snow, excess snow. And when you have droughts, of course, we have water shortages. So you can manipulate public opinion, you can convince people of climate change, and if you can do that, you can impose carbon taxes. Agrochemical companies, there are 10 agrochemical companies that run pretty much the whole business. Some of you are familiar with Monsanto, I'd imagine. And what Monsanto are doing, they're bringing out patents, seed patents. They're bringing out aluminium-resistant seed patents, sorghum seed patents. And for me, this is the daddy of all patents. This is a stress-tolerant plants and methods thereof. And it talks about adiabatic stress in plants. And if you like any of these foods, this is in the patent, they're proposing to genetically modify these seeds. So as a farmer, you are farming organic or natural seeds, and if you're having your harvesting patterns interrupted through adverse weather, the only way you can survive is to either go GM or you start diversifying. And going GM probably is on the cards for many farmers. This is a quote by Dr. Vandana Shiva. She's a renowned physicist in India. She talks about Monsanto. She says, if they, Monsanto, control seed, they control food. They know it. It's strategic. It's more powerful than bombs. It's more powerful than guns. This is the best way to control populations of the world. Social control. Going into a bit of sensitive, awkward territory here. The Kissinger report came out in 1974, the NSSM, the National Security Study Memorandum. quote, "Since population growth is a major determinant of increases in food demand, allocation of scarce resources should take account of what steps the country is taking in population control, as well as food production. In these sensitive relations, however," and this is it is important, in style as well as substance, to avoid the appearance of coercion. So what they're saying is, we have to avoid being seen to manipulate the food because we want to manipulate. A quote from Dr. John Holdren, and he is the science advisor to President Obama. Quote, "A program of sterilizing women after their second or third child, despite relatively greater difficulties of the operation than vasectomy, might be easier to implement than trying to sterilize men." You'd expect whistleblowers to be in this kind of field. One of the questions I get is, if all this is going on, how comes nobody's stepping forward? If this is so big, how comes nobody's coming forward? Well, there have been. People have come forward on this. And a very, very courageous Swedish politician, Pernilla Hagberg, came forward. And she says, quote, "These trails contain a multitude of chemicals, viruses and heavy metals such as aluminium that influence the weather. This is a controversial and extremely sensitive issue that is very interesting to examine. I know there are several politicians who want to, but do not dare." And this is the geopolitical bit. To be able to control the weather and use it for their own purposes is very advantageous for power structures.
The videos or the excerpts that are present in this video from films such as Why in the World Are They Explained, and also the documents, should be enough to convince anybody that these programs are actually going on.